looking back on it, is remarkable. You wondered about both of them coming into the tournament. Or was either one going to be ready? Could either of them or both have been ripe for an upset against somebody because they just weren't that match tough, and physically they weren't at their best yet, and they had some lingering inner doubts in their mind? Is that he went on to go down. He played another pretty sloppy game, and he went down 2-love in the second set. And that's where it was getting really dangerous, because he's lost 8 out of 10 games, and Sinner has broken him at that stage 4 times. And the danger there, it's kind of like when you alluded to the possibility of a bagel in the first set or a 6-love set, is that the danger there is if Sinner blitzes through the second set 6-2 or 6-3, it's going to be a long way back for Carlos from 2 sets down. But I felt like we were treated, we saw an improved level of play over those last 3 sets that made this match, it gave it a more extraordinary quality.
That game at the end of the 4th set, as you said, they were both serving very well. They were both playing very well. I remember during set 3 and to some extent set 4, the forehand from Jannik was just off the charts.
Yes.
But that game that you've already spoken about in depth, which is fantastic, but I wonder if that's the game that Carlos probably looks back with the most sort of pleasure and smile. I mean, he will have played 1,000 games in 2024, and that's just a figure I've plucked from nowhere. But of those 1,000 games, maybe the most important game was that one.
Ready. Play.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, or good early afternoon it is for you right now, Steve in New York. How are you doing?
Good, John. It's good to be back with you again. It's been a long time. I think you said we went 10 days.
Yeah, 10 days. I mean, the last couple of years or last 18 months or so, we've sort of done 3 or 4 sort of episodes a year. So it's been every 3-4 months, often around the time of a Grand Slam. But this time I couldn't resist to squeeze you in again as we enter this interesting period of the year in tennis terms, in that we don't have a huge amount of tennis going on, but we can certainly reflect on the 11 months that have just gone. And we're going to reflect today on one match in particular, which was Carlos Alcaraz against Jannik Sinner at the French Open in the semi-final. We've chosen this year, Steve, 5 matches to reflect upon. We found 1 or 2 quite easy, shall we say, on the ATP tour, on the men's tour, and also on the women's tour. But we found probably the rest a little bit trickier, actually, because we sort of looked at the slams and we looked at all the other tournaments as well across the year, including 250s and up. And we sort of found 10 matches that we thought were pretty good, but probably not elite. And this was actually one of those that was sort of, could be in the 5 and eventually was. Do you think, off the top of your head, was this a match? Because I just said, look, do you fancy talking about this match? And you said, yeah, sure. But maybe you're, Steve, thinking, this was good. Well, I'll tell you some of the other matches that didn't make it, okay, Steve? And then you can think about that.
Sure.
We had the 5-setter between Tiafoe and Shelton that didn't make it, and this one did. We had the 5-setter as well between Medvedev and Zverev in the semi-final at the Australian Open. So that didn't make it, and this one did. There's a sort of good comparison between those 3, and we had one space, and we went for this one. What do you think about our choice?
Good choice. I would say this is so interesting as you're bringing that up. It makes me think of here we were sitting in our same chairs, I suspect, 1 year ago, talking about the match that was our subject for 2023, the Wimbledon final between Djokovic and Alcaraz.
Yep.
Here's the parallel. Here's the similarity that I would look back to last year, and we did discuss it a bit in that segment, that you could argue that Cincinnati between Djokovic and Alcaraz was, because of the drama and the heights that it reached in the 3rd set, you might have an argument there between the 2 matches. But in the end, Wimbledon was the right choice, because Wimbledon is Wimbledon, and it's the biggest match of the year that they played, despite the fact that Djokovic won all the other majors. A huge win for Alcaraz, and definitely worthy of match of the year. This one, I kind of feel very similarly about it. This was a 5-setter at a major in a semi, and it's, and very likely the winner of the Sinner Alcaraz match was going to beat Zverev, was going to be the favorite against Zverev in any case and probably win the title, as Carlos eventually did. And yet, again, I find myself thinking of the spectacular tennis that reached maybe more dizzying heights when Alcaraz played Sinner again later in the year in Beijing and came from 3-love down in the tiebreak, double mini break down to win 7 points in a row to close out that match. That was also a beauty. It's just fascinating. I didn't think of it until you started talking about those other matches. And I said, wait a minute, this is reminiscent of 2023 in that sense, that I think that in some ways they scale the heights more in Beijing. But
I agree.
But sometimes also you can argue that that best of three, it's more compressed. There's a lot of different reasons why that might happen and less pressure. But this match is the right choice. I'm totally with you in the end that this French semi is the one we should be discussing.
To be honest with you, I wanted to speak to you about this match, just sort of Grand Slam, 5 sets. We spoke about a 5-setter last year as well. The Sinner Alcaraz match in Beijing is also in our top 5. I think it has to be. There's an argument, just like there was last year, that this particular match wasn't even the best Sinner Alcaraz match of the year. But what I want to say, though, at this point, before we sort of get into the nuts and bolts of the match itself, where do you stand, Steve, on the sort of 3-set, 5-set debate? Some people saying that we don't have the attention spans anymore for the 5 sets and we should compress it and just go for the 3 sets. But I don't know. I still enjoy a good 5-setter, that's for sure.
I'm with you on that. Listen, I get it. I understand the argument. I think I'm all for the idea that when the tour decided back in that period of, say, 2006, when Federer and Nadal played that 5-hour-plus Rome final, they started to realize we're ruining these guys. We can't do this anymore in our 1000s because they're going to be pulling out of the next one because they're just too debilitated. So I think I don't want to ever see the slams change. I think the tour is right to stay to best of 3 everywhere.
Me too.
Davis Cup unfortunately has compressed again, which I'm not wild about, but I'm thrilled that the Grand Slam events stay with tradition because there's nothing more demanding than navigating your way through a best of 5 set match physically and mentally. And I would hate to see that lost. So I think the game has it about right now, where the majors stay with tradition and the tour sticks with best of 3.
Yeah, I tell you who else is pretty happy to see 5-set matches, and that's Carlos Alcaraz, who basically has won all bar one of his 5-set matches in his career, which is, for someone so young as well, is kind of incredible.
You're so right, John, because it isn't just that he's young. I mean, yes, it shows a remarkable maturity, and some could argue, he's got the stamina to get through those matches, but it requires physical, mental, emotional strength of the highest order, and he has shown that time and again. And of course, in the topic at hand, he did it back to back in Roland Garros, which is just phenomenal. To be 2 sets to 1 down in both matches and win them in 5.
We're looking at Alcaraz and Sinner as being the giants of the game. They shared the Grand Slam tally this year at 2 each. If there are certain elements that probably Sinner is slightly ahead of Alcaraz on, and there are obviously certain elements that Alcaraz is ahead on, this 5-set dynamic, I do think, is probably you're going to favor Carlos at the moment, and that 5-set thought process, if you like, and if it's going to go 5, given that he's so impressive in over 5 sets, probably, and also the physical side of things, it is something that Jannik has undoubtedly improved, particularly in the last 12 months. But I still think it's a small chink in his armor.
Yeah, fair point. Absolutely fair point. He also, in fairness, he'd come into the French. He'd had some flu. He'd been injured. Carlos came into the French having been injured with his arm. So each of them played a very abbreviated clay court season, with Carlos pulling out all the clay court events except for Madrid, where he lost to Rublev, and Sinner losing to Tsitsipas in Monte Carlo, and then he got to the quarters, I guess, on Madrid, and then had to pull out, and he was gone. So the demands are great, and that also adds to the case for why this match was so special. That each of them had come off some difficult circumstances leading up to Roland Garros, and now here they were fighting it out in the semifinals and battling some cramping issues both during the match. So, yeah, I must say, looking back on it, is remarkable. You wondered about both of them coming into the tournament. Or was either one going to be ready? Could either of them or both have been ripe for an upset against somebody because they just weren't that match tough, and physically they weren't at their best yet, and they had some lingering inner doubts in their minds. But they both they both dispelled that in a hurry and arrived for that semifinal appointment as expected.
Steve, there was another match that we considered as well as one of our top 5, but also didn't make it, and it was the final itself. If you were the kingmaker, if you were the decision maker, Steve, which one of the two would you go for? Would you go for Sinner Alcaraz semi-final? Would you go for the Zverev Alcaraz final?
Sinner Alcaraz, because I thought there was some great tennis in the final, but I think you look at this match, okay, that we can get into it in more detail, but I would say that the standard was higher from beginning to end, despite Alcaraz having a very slow start. And while I felt that what harmed the final was that Zverev, who worked so hard, John, to come from 5-2 down in the third set at 1-set-all and ran out that set to go 2-1, and he's shaking a fist at his father in the best possible way, like, here I am, 1 set away.
Yeah.
And I felt like his level fell off so significantly, so drastically in the first 4 games of the fourth set. He pretty much gave that set away, and then he didn't play well in the fifth either. And he said later his legs were gone. And so I thought that match declined, unfortunately, taking nothing away from Carlos, whose standard remained, his standard was very high the last 2 sets, but I didn't feel he was pushed that much. This one, I would say, from beginning to end, slightly better, just slightly. There were some great moments in the final as well.
Sure. Both players, I think, dropped just 1 set en route to the semi-final. Carlos did so against the Dutchman Jesper de Jong. Jannik Sinner dropping his set against Moutet in the 4th round before beating Dimitrov in straight sets in the quarters. So both had a fairly routine, I would suggest, path to the semi-finals. Maybe Sin dropping that first set against Moutet, maybe a little bit scarier for him. But generally, they both were probably expected to get to the semi-final, except for some of those injury doubts that you highlighted, which I think is really important. How they had both of them had a very disjointed clay court season, but they were there and they were ready for this semi-final. Were you leaning one way or another before the match began, or were you sort of 50-50?
I think I was leaning a little bit towards Sinner.
Okay.
For a variety of reasons, and obviously having won the first major of the year and establishing himself as the best player in the world. And I did think Carlos was going to be harmed more by his disjointed campaign, as you put it, leading up to Roland Garros than he was. So it's not that I was only leaning slightly towards Sinner, very, very slightly. And then, of course, when he got off to the great start, I liked his chances even more.
Yeah, I mean, great start is an understatement. I mean, it's 4-love pretty quickly. Alcaraz, I do think he wasn't playing very well in that first set. Sinner was doing great, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't, at that point, I didn't feel like maybe we were going to be in for an epic that we ended up, in getting involved with. And I remember, I think the first game, Sinner broke, actually, and there was a pretty horrible forehand, just massive forehand from Alcaraz that smashes into the net, and that's 1-love. It soon becomes 4-love, as I said. And at this point, I'm thinking, ooh, you never know, especially on clay. Could break again, and we could be looking at a bagel set, although in the end, Carlos avoided that.
Yeah, Carlos managed to get 1 break back. He got it back to 4-2.
He did.
Chances to hold in the 7th game, then lost his serve for a 3rd time.
Yeah,
that was an interesting start because Sinner also, in that patch that you described, John, had a couple of love holds. He was looking strong, and I think maybe he got a little complacent when he was the 2 breaks up, and Carlos managed to squeeze one of them back. But you're so right. The image, the lingering image of that first set is of Carlos spraying forehands. Now, what's interesting, John, is that the commentators, almost without fail, they're very critical of Carlos in phases like that when he's missing. But I think where I disagree with them is that it's just his nature to keep going for his shots. And sometimes he can overdo it. Sometimes he can be too zealous. And he loves to please the crowd, but he finds a way. We saw it in that Wimbledon final with Novak as well, the first of the two, the one that we discussed last year, where, you know, he got blitzed in the first set 6-1, and people were questioning him then. He was missing a ton of forehand returns, but he finds his range eventually. And the guy on the other side of the net, whether it's Sinner or Djokovic or whomever, they know that he can strike gold at any time and be a different player. And I feel like he has to keep going for his shots. That's his game. That's how he plays. And I'm not always in accord with the critics when they're jumping all over him at times when he's making the unforced errors, because he gets his openings and he takes them. What's interesting in this case is that he went on to go down. He played another pretty sloppy game, and he went down 2-love in the second set. And that's where it was getting really dangerous, because he's lost 8 out of 10 games, and Sinner has broken him at that stage 4 times. And the danger there, it's kind of like when you alluded to the possibility of a bagel in the first set or a 6-love set, is that the danger there is if Sinner blitzes through this second set 6-2 or 6-3, you know, it's going to be a long way back for Carlos and 2 sets down. But Carlos I thought he really started finding his range in the next 3 games. I think he won him at the cost of 4 or 5 points. It was a pretty easy run to 3-2. And then to me, there was a very big point. Okay. It was in the 6th game. Mm-hmm. And Sinner's trying to stem the tide a bit. He's trying to kind of get back, make sure he'd gone from being a set and a break up to now serving at 2-3 in the second. He wants to see if he can break Carlos's momentum. And he's 30-15 up in the 6th game to try to go 40-15. He's got a very short ball on his forehand. And it was one of those things where he's worried that Carlos, you know, it's who can outwit the other, and do I go down the line or cross court, and what do I do? He decides to go down the line, but he did it with no conviction. He just sort of wasn't that deep, and it didn't have much pace on it. And Carlos had any number of options, and he just said, okay, thank you very much. Topspin lob, cross court winner from Carlos. Huge point, because if Sinner gets to 40-15 and keeps holding, it's a different kind of set. Instead, Carlos played a couple of brilliant points to follow, gets the break to keep going to 4-2, holds for 5-2, and eventually wins the set 6-3. So big momentum shift in that second set for Alcaraz to come from that breakdown and win 6 out of 7 games to be at 1 set all.
And when you mention some golden shots that we know Carlos is capable of, once he's found that range, we did see a few of these in sort of sets 2 to 5, I would suggest. There's one that's a really good one, I think, at the beginning of the 3rd set, which is a set that Carlos goes on to lose. But it is actually now looking like Carlos, the momentum was with him, because he breaks, I think, and there's a backhand cross-court winner, and he sort of, you know, punches the air, and he's smiling. Right. And I'm just thinking this is a very different Carlos to one we saw an hour ago when, you know, he lost 8 out of the first 10 games, as you said.
You're so right. That was a fascinating stage of the match, because he played that game and made that spectacular shot that you mentioned. He's up a break 2-1. Yeah. Sid got it right back. He played a really good, aggressive game. He was pounding forehands in that next game, and he hit a winner off the forehand that got him back on serve. And then that's when he started looking a bit you worried about his condition, because he was shaking his hand out. There was that long game. 4 or 5 deuces, and I think he saved 4 break points, 5 deuces, and he finally held despite cramping in that right hand. And then he got a little treatment at the changeover. It seemed to be running up into his arm, because the trainer rubbed his hand. He rubbed the hand and a little bit onto the arm, and you worried about but somehow that did the trick. And maybe somehow it was getting better as that long service game went on. But it was very important that he held there, because then he breaks Carlos for 4-2 after having had the hand and arm treated. And it was on one of those interesting points where Carlos decides he's going to serve and volley. And it had worked a few times, but Sinner saw the kick serve coming and angled the backhand return acutely cross-court. Fantastic winner, up 4-2, and then that carried him through the set. So that was a really interesting set, because now he had done to Carlos what Carlos had done to him the previous set, coming from a breakdown to win the set in the end rather comfortably. And again, you thought once more, okay, he's back he's on the ascendancy again. He's in pretty good shape now. You never count Carlos out because Carlos was still playing well, but you felt like Sinner had kind of made amends for losing the second set from a break up by winning the third set from a breakdown.
One of these sort of ingredients we often look for when we talk about great matches, and you've obviously written a book about great matches, so you'll know better than anyone, is when we like to see both players, playing well at the same time. I think certainly in the first set that was anything but the case. But we do like to see. I do think that the match gets better.
Yes.
From that first set onwards, and I do think they are maybe not quite playing amazingly at the same time, especially in sets 2 and 3. But we're getting a better Sinner Alcaraz match now.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. The level was going up. It carried into the fourth. What was interesting, John, about the fourth to me was you had Carlos in the first set lose his serve 3 times. You had him lose his serve again once early in the second, and then he lost it 2 more times in the third after being a breakup. So he's lost at that stage. It's been broken 6 times. And that had to be a real concern to him. But he settled down really nicely in the fourth. He was serving much better, but so was Sinner. And Sinner had won like 16 out of 19 points on his serve up until 4-5. But now he's serving to stay in the set. That was one of the most critical games of the match because he had 30 love to get to 5-all. Carlos played a fantastic point, brilliant points, 30-15. But at 30-15, Carlos drew Sinner in with the drop shot. Sinner got there with time to spare. He went down the line pretty deep to Carlos's back and put up a lob that was quite short. And Sinner even let it bounce just to be sure of himself. But he wasn't sure if Carlos was going to run to the open court or not. He was a bit confused maybe, and he hit the smash on the bounce wide down the line. That was a critical miss because, again, just like the earlier point, if he wins this, it's 40-15. He's probably at 5-all. Instead, it's 30-all. Carlos played 2 stupendous points in a row to break him from there. You can't give him those openings. That's one of the most commendable traits in Carlos. If he sees any sign of weakness, he pounces. I've seen him do it so many times against so many formidable opponents, and this was another example of it. But Sinner must have lamented that point so much later when he looked back. And if he just probably would have just been much wiser to go cross court with some safety. And he probably was going to put it away. I mean, if he hits the smash well of a lob that short, which landed, by the way, inside the service line, just inside the service line, that lob. I mean, he's probably going to put that away if he goes cross court. So I don't think he should have worried so much about whether Carlos might dart over there. But whatever the reasons, it was a point he shouldn't have lost. And it was a point, it registered with Carlos, and Carlos was thrilled to be at 30-all instead of 40-15 down. And he said, okay, I'm taking matters in my own hands. And boy, did it carry over because Carlos played 3 terrific games to open the 5th set. He broke immediately. So he carried he by the time he got to 3-love in the 5th, he had won 5 consecutive games. And from there, it was awfully difficult, John. I don't know if you felt the same way. For Sinner kept knocking on the door. He'd get to deuce. He did it at 3-1, got to deuce, but Carlos had a drop shot that kind of grazed the net cord and went over. And there was another deuce game at 4-2, but a great wide serve from Carlos, service winner, I would call it, and then he holds on again. And even the last game, it took 3 match points for Carlos. He won it on his 3rd match point. So Sinner was fighting hard and being competitive in Carlos's service games, but remarkably, after all those 6 service breaks earlier, Sinner unable to break Carlos in the 4th and 5th sets, unable to get any breaks at all, which was a lot of it had to do with the discipline and determination of Carlos because he, on those big deuce points, and when it counted, he didn't waver at all, and he made Sinner beat him. And so I agree with you. Get back to your earlier point. Tennis, to me, the best tennis was probably the 3rd, 4th, and 5th sets. A bit choppy in the first 2. Certainly Carlos in the first set was choppy, and there was some very good tennis in the second, but I would say the last 3 sets were the best, which, by the way, is another one of those things when I've done the book, when I wrote the book, and when I've thought myself about assessing the great matches. I prefer those matches where the level is highest toward the end. You know what I'm saying? It's like, you get a 6-2 5th set, you're a bit disappointed. For instance, that 07 final between Roger and Rafa was terrific. But in the end, after some all early break opportunities for Rafa, Roger kind of ran away with the set. Same thing with the great 2009 Australian Open final. Again, Rafa and Roger, which the first 4 sets were spectacular. Then suddenly from 2-all in the 5th, Roger fell apart. He was awful the rest of the way. He'd be the first to admit it. And no knock on Rafa, who was thoroughly professional and got it done. But you were disappointed. In this case, no. I felt like those were great sets. And as I say, that Sinner kept probing to get that break back in the 5th. He didn't go away. You know, I felt like we were treated, you know, we saw an improved level of play over those last 3 sets that made this match, it gave it a more extraordinary quality.
Of course.
Do you agree with that?
I did, yeah. But just coming on to the point you were making about, you know, these matches reaching a crescendo, and they're the ones that we like and enjoy the most, rather than the other way around. Even if overall, you could even argue if a match has 4 incredible sets and the 4th, 5th one's a bit of a dip, we sort of wouldn't consider it for this category. And yet you could probably have a match. Well, here's an example. Last year, Cincinnati, set and a half with a non-event. In Cincinnati, the final between Djokovic and Alcaraz, where Alcaraz wins the first set, he's up a break in the second, seems to be cruising to victory, and then it comes alive. And so you could, if you just looked at it minute by minute, go, well, half of the match was so-so. The other half was incredible, and we walk away going, wow, that's one of the best matches I've seen in maybe that year or any other year. And so
I would disagree slightly, John. In the first set of that Cincinnati match, and then it was getting stiflingly hot, and obviously Djokovic had to make a couple of trips to the locker room after those sets. He was feeling that heat exhaustion almost. It was really almost unhealthily hot. But he played well. Djokovic was up at 4-2, and Carlos came back to win at 7-5. So I thought the first set was pretty good. Then I thought it was going. Carlos was kind of cruising up until the middle of the second set when Djokovic made his move, and then you're right. Then it just soared to another level. Djokovic saving a match point in the tiebreak in the second set, and then spectacular third set with Carlos saving all his match points and finally going down in the tiebreak to Novak. So I agree with you. But again, we liked the fact that part 2 of that match clearly surpassed part 1.
Yeah, exactly. Just one thing about this Sinner Alcaraz match at the French Open, the semi-final. That game at the end of the 4th set, as you said, they were both serving very well. They were both playing very well. I remember during set 3 and to some extent set 4, the forehand from Jannik was just off the charts.
Yes.
But that game that you've already spoken about in depth, which is fantastic, but I wonder if that's the game that Carlos probably looks back with the most sort of pleasure and smile. I mean, he'll have played 1,000 games in 2024, and that's just a figure I've plucked from nowhere. But of those 1,000 games, maybe the most important game was that one, because you mentioned that. But even if you've just kept yourself in a point, honestly, that delight and pleasure you get when you see an error like Sinner hits off the smash is still great. You've stolen the point.
You've stolen the point. How many times you know you've been gifted that point, but again, that's Carlos. That's the mindset of Carlos. He's a killer in those situations. He's a ruthless competitor and I mean that as a compliment. That's a word we've often used about Rafa and Novak too, and it's a compliment because it's like, okay, if you're gonna expose your vulnerability, I'm coming after you, and that's how you're supposed to compete. And it's Carlos's best quality, as opposed to when we see Carlos more vulnerable. Some of these matches where he starts slowly and he can't get going, like the U.S. Open, where you say to yourself, "Oh, what a shame! Carlos is just not there tonight." You know he's trying, but where he can't find his game and he can't find openings and ends up losing to inferior players. That can happen, but boy, you put him
more so than Sinner, right? So we were talking about the strengths and the weaknesses of the two. Certainly at the moment, Carlos seems to be a little bit more vulnerable to can't believe he lost that match, you know, or where was he tonight? Whereas Jannik seems to, you know, as his Grand Slam results show, he got to, I think, the quarterfinals or further at every slam this year, and probably could have and should have beaten Medvedev if he didn't have some physical elements there. So, you know, he pretty much turned up for every tournament, which is why he won at least a set in every single match he played this year. With Carlos, there is this just occasionally, it just doesn't happen for him. And it never, even over 5 sets, he can't get it back.
So true, so true. But and that's what makes it so interesting. We discussed this, I think, a little bit in our last podcast. But here's Sinner, and you described it well. It never loses before the quarters, always winning a set. Loses 6 matches all year, half of the 6 to Carlos, with nothing to show for it on the other side of the ledger. No wins, and all 3 he won the first set. All 3 he had chances, particularly the last 2. This one that we're discussing now, that French semi, which was so critical for Carlos because it led him to a 5-set win over Zverev for the title and gave him the confidence to defend his title at Wimbledon. I think it made a big difference. Okay. Just with a huge boost. And then they play in Beijing for the 3rd time of the year. Indian Wells was the first one of the year where it was a 6-1 first set for Sinner. But after that, Carlos was pretty unstoppable. And he played really well the last 2 sets. So it wasn't like Sinner had many opportunities after that. But in Beijing, it was hanging in the balance the whole way. They both were pretty much in peak form and came down to that final set tiebreak, and Sinner is serving at 3-love in the tiebreak. And you would have to believe at that stage with his serve and his game, he's going to close it out. He never wins another point. He made one forehand error, just where he hit a ball a little bit long, and it was not a terrible error, but slightly uncharacteristic. The other 6 points were all sheer brilliance from Carlos. So poor Sinner had to say to himself, what do I have to do to beat this guy? And he even was commenting on it the next week in Shanghai, I believe. Okay. There were some quotes from him talking about, I wake up in the morning thinking about what I need to do to beat him. And it said that in a good way. You could tell he kind of had a smile on his face, like, this is my challenge. This is my task now. Because Carlos, he realized, for it happened 3 times. Now, he did get something of a psychological boost, John, by beating Carlos in the EXO tournament for worth a lot of money in Saudi Arabia. It doesn't go in the record books, but I think that one it registered in his mind. At least it must have felt good to win any kind of a match, even if that wasn't going to go down officially on the ATP stats. So that's what's going to be interesting.
If in the future, Steve, but if in the future, Carlos, say, wins the next 2, there is a pattern emerging. We saw, much later in their careers, but eventually we saw a pattern emerge with Rafa and Novak, where Rafa sort of was 50-50 on a lot of surfaces, but Rafa probably had the advantage on clay. But then suddenly it was like, when we're off clay, I'm winning. Said Novak.
Good point. Good point. I hope what you're saying does not come true for the sake of...
I don't think it will, but you never know. Just
it's definitely a possibility. I don't want to discard it. I'm just saying what I'm the fan in me, the reporter who loves to watch tennis, wants to see some fluctuating fortunes in this rivalry and see Sinner at least get back into it in 2025, because we're going to be watching them for a decade or more. And you just want to see this rivalry play out in such a way. I mean, look, Roger and Novak, you look at Novak versus Roger, it ends up 27-23. You look at for Novak, you look at Novak and Rafa, 31-29 for Novak. Though in the end, they went through dominant phases, but I feel like Sinner came into this year 4-3 against Carlos. Some big wins in there, including one at Wimbledon. But then he loses 3 in a row this year in what turned out to be the greatest year of his career. Otherwise, almost an unblemished year where he wins 2 majors. So I hope that he's competitive with him next year, because I just think I want to see these guys keep pushing each other to the hilt and making these demands of each other. And then for the sake of suspense and interest and the long-term rivalry, I want to see it. And I suspect, I guess the bigger part of me says I lean toward that scenario over your other one. But you're right. You just can't tell. You can't tell. That's what makes tennis so interesting. You don't know where it's leading. And certainly Carlos goes into the year saying to himself, look, I have immense respect for Jannik I will never take him lightly. But I think Carlos would say to you, look, I don't want Jannik to hear what I'm saying right now, but I think I'm a better player than he is. And I honestly think he does believe that. In turn, Sinner says to himself, no, I think I'm better, but I think I've got to find a slightly different formula, and I've got to be a little bit better under pressure against this guy. And I have to maybe be willing to take a few more risks. Maybe that's what Sinner is saying in the back of his mind, that I've got to be maybe a little more daring at times, because he's beating me to the punch, and he's taking these matches out of my hands. And the Beijing final 7 points is the perfect illustration that Sinner he didn't suddenly start double faulting and making flagrant unforced errors. Carlos had made one spectacular shot after another, but then Sinner has to say, what do I have to do to prevent that from happening? I've got to be a little more assertive in these rallies and look for the openings and go for them, and be willing to miss a little bit more than I'm accustomed to, but make those winners when the openings are there.
Yeah, fair point. There were some incredible shot making from Carlos in this match at the French Open. I remember there was the backhand cross-court pass that I just mentioned. There was another one which I made a note of. Maybe it's hyperbole, but I was thinking maybe that's the shot of the year. I mean, he's so far. I mean, on my screen, it's one of those classic ones at Philippe Chatrier, when he's so deep and so far off the court. He's so far south, he's almost in Marseille. That you're thinking, where is he? Oh, hello, there's a forehand winner there. And it's just, classic.
And then it's funny. When I start thinking of when I talk to you about him, then these things come back to me the way they come back to you. But there was also when he broke at the start of the fifth, he also there was a backhand pass in there that hit at the most acute of angles that was just ridiculously good. And he puffs his chest out at times like this. And why not? Why wouldn't he? Because he even surprises himself a bit with the shots that he can pull off under pressure. And it's off both sides. It's, the explosiveness of the forehand, but the angles he can create off the back end, the deception. The other thing I think that maybe he does at this point in the rivalry a bit better, John, than Jannik, is a little bit more better use of the backhand down the line, a little bit more willingness to go, and not recklessly, but if he sees a chance to change direction in a rally, he does that. And that was the match point as well that closed out Jannik in this match at Roland Garros. Was a great backhand down the line that forced Jannik on the run to pull a forehand cross court wide. So I think of those traits that he's got, and that. Listen, I don't know what Darren Cahill thinks, and I wouldn't presume to think that I could suggest to him what Carlos should do, but I mean what Jannik should do. But Jannik is surely focusing on this right now, and it means those first couple of matches next year. You're alluding to those and the potential. What if Carlos wins those? Then where are we? Those are going to be fascinating matches, especially if they're in majors, especially like if they played in Australia right off the bat, or they played again in Roland Garros. And
I wonder if they play in Australia, though. I might just be leaning Sinner, because quicker surface. I think maybe the natural surfaces of grass and clay, I would lean Alcaraz, especially over 5 sets.
Yeah.
I think Indian Wells is arguably Alcaraz. It might well end up being the tournament where he flourishes most at the end of his career. Just the slow, gritty nature of that hard court, I think, is just perfect for him. Yeah. But maybe Australia, if Carlos gets it, it's not quite as dramatic. But if Carlos gets Jannik in Australia, reigning champion, Carlos has generally struggled there. It will be a mini sort of Rafa over Roger at 2008 moment, because I'm not saying that this has necessarily reached those heights, but it'll be just like, I'm beating you in the conditions that should be best for you,
Yeah, right. Good point. Because you're right. You would say going in the conditions, and based on Sinner is going to go back there as defending champion, the fact that Carlos hasn't played well there yet, and didn't play well this past year in losing to Zverev, and yeah, that would be a big blow to Sinner. And conversely, if Sinner got him there, if Sinner wins in 4 or 5 over Carlos, and that carries him into the season feeling better about himself in that regard. So it's going to be fascinating. But this one, I think we've chewed on it pretty well, and I feel like it was definitely one of the highlights of the year. And listen, to Jannik's credit, I mean, obviously, Carlos went on to Wimbledon and had the scare with Tiafoe, where he's down 2-1 and 4-all love 30 in the fourth. He's in real trouble there, and he pulls out the fourth in a breaker and wins in 5. That was the key match because, you know, he had some more tough matches along the way, but eventually beat Novak in straight in the final. He was riding high, but then Sinner comes back and gets the Open to get the split in the majors and ends the year so strong with Turin and the Davis Cup that, you know, they both took away a lot out of this year. Sinner far more consistent, very worthy of that number 1 ranking. Carlos would be the first to admit it. The unfortunate thing with Carlos, John, being a bit streaky, was that you really felt like he should have ended with 2 majors. He should end the year number 2.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, he doesn't. He ends it at 3 behind Zverev, which means that we could have some more semifinal meetings with these people for a while, and you don't want them to play in the semis.
I want that's the last thing I want to finish on. We want to be seeing them in a Grand Slam final in 2025.
Right, exactly. And hopefully, you know, we could have some luck with the draws, you know, and because then you could still have Carlos playing Sinner in a semi, and Carlos. I mean, Carlos plays, say Sinner. Either way, where they end up on opposite halves, and one of them has to go through Zverev and does, but they meet in the final. That's better. But of course, we're going to still have Novak in the mix, so that's going to also be interesting to see how the draws play out, because he comes in number 7 in the world. So who knows which one of those guys Novak might play in the quarters.
I mean, you could have a scenario where one or the other has to go through Novak in the quarters and then each other in the semis, for example, and then who knows who will in the final.
And they still have one more match to play.
Yeah, against whoever's in the final, which I'm sure will have had a good run. Listen, Steve, once again, this has been an absolute pleasure. A much quicker turnaround for us on this occasion than normal, but well worth it as always. And fingers crossed we get to see these 2 massive giants already of the game, even at their young age, meet again in a Grand Slam final in 2025. And you and I will be here all for it, I'm sure.
John, I just want to say one thing. You know, a lot of people talk when Djokovic hired Murray, that the prevailing view was that Murray is a great coach because he's got a terrific tennis mind. And I can tell you from having had so many of these discussions with you on our podcast that what I enjoy the most is your tennis mind, because you have a really nice feel for the game. And I never cease to be impressed by it when we talk.
Steve, that's a huge compliment, especially coming from someone like you. And I just want to put out there for Novak, if and when you and Andy split up, I am here. Okay, Novak, if you want me to take you to the French Open, for example, I am available. Email address is easily to find, but give us a follow on the social media and then we'll connect. But thank you very much, Steve. And your tennis mind is certainly one that I'm keen to tap into again very soon, come the new year and probably sometime around the time of Australia. And yeah, big thanks for coming on today.
Thanks, John. Look forward to the next one.
If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell so you don't miss out on all things tennis.